she's a pretty formidable lady. She was not a nice person. And there is, you can see there is at the moment, cute-looking little boy on the lower left. And then there's what you probably think, oh, well, age has faded or something happened to whatever is on the right. Not so at all. A darling little boy is Caracalla. He had a younger brother, Gita. He was very worried about Gita, that he might usurp his power, I don't know why. And so he erased him, both in the picture and in life. Bye-bye Gita, and all effigies of Gita were defaced. So, poor Gita, if you have an older brother, don't be too jealous of him, or he'll get you. But anyway, you can see here also, very interesting, and notice Julia's hairdo. Hairdos become important to art historians because they can help date pieces if you don't know who the sitter is, because hairstyles change very definitely. Usually they copied the empresses, and pieces have been dated by the hair. And this is a fourth style Pompeian painting. For, of course, interdisciplinary purposes, your students need to know how come so much Pompeian art has survived, as well as art from Herculaneum, as distinct from the churches, as distinct from architecture in churches. You should know what had caused Pompeian art to be preserved. So anyway, this is the fourth style, and you need to know that there are four styles. And this, again, is a detail from a wall. This whole piece includes pillars that set off the scene, and if you know it's got pillars around it, it's demarcated, it would be from the second style, but since the pillars aren't here, I'm not going to ask that question. It is actually a mythological scene, but I think it is from the Iliad, and of course, you have the Aeneid on your competition. And I did find a few cases where we have references to the Aeneid in art. I was just amazed how few they were. I really had to go hunting for it. Anyway, here you have the Odyssey landscape, and quite realistic. And again, the interest in the landscape, which of course, if you're sitting in a house, you would like to have the outside brought in, particularly if you're in the winter. So here is a very beautiful example of Roman landscape painting, and really with very great use of perspective and even of atmospheric perspective. So all this was not rediscovered until the Renaissance. And now we get to sculpture. If any of you have the book, and you don't need it, of Roman art from the Louvre, this is the frontispiece, or rather the cover piece. There's a portrait of an unknown woman, but again, the most interesting part here, and the most realistic, is the hairdo. Heavily drilled, and all this drilling in the curls causes a beautiful play of light and shade. And they also did that in the beards of the bearded emperors. So the sculpture will have both sculpture in the round, like this here portrait bust, and also bas and high relief and friezes. In this case, sometimes the Romans inset stones in the eyes, but I don't think there was any reason to suspect that stones were inserted here. We'll see later where a pupil has been drilled. Usually in Roman art, the eyes look like this. Maybe they were painted, it's possible. Don't quote me on that. As I said, there's certain people you need to recognize. You need to recognize that this is Augustus, formerly Octavian. He was the heir of Julius Caesar, and of course the first Roman emperor. And under him, it was a great change in Roman style. We'll get to that in a minute. But we get from the ultra-realistic to a much more idealized style. Not that the portrait or the features have been lost. You can always recognize Augustus. Of course, there were many copies made once a successful image existed, because that was one way of showing who the emperor was in the provinces. I mean, how were you going to see the emperor? You could see him on coins, and it is sometimes possible to identify a sculpture of an emperor by his coin. The coin would have had the name, so you compare the portrait bust to the coin, and you can figure out who it was. With Augustus, you have no such problem. You know what he looked like. There are many portraits of him, and this one shows him as a priest. How, even if I did not see the caption, as a good student of Roman art, would I know he is a priest? All Roman priests have a hood over their head. So if you find a statue like that, you know the person is portrayed as a priest, and of course you're not priest for life. Augustus was I think Caesar also was the Pontiff Maximus, as just being a supreme priest was not a position for life. Also, you did not have to be celibate. But then the Pope took over that title, interestingly enough. And later copies of Augustus become even more idealized or Hellenized. This was the style of the late Greek period, which Augustus took over, or had his artists take over, because he was creating a new age out of the old republic, which had become fairly corrupt, or corrupted by its leaders, shall we say. And Augustus, as far as I know, is always portrayed, even his later portraits, as in the prime of youth, which would have been how a Hellenized portrait would be done. Now, by comparison, we have here somebody who is going to become very notorious. Even if we didn't know from the features, the hairstyle, again, would identify this person because it was typical of the Claudians. Don't worry about that. Nero was not a blood relative of the Claudians, but the poor Emperor Claudius adopted him. He was bamboozled into that. And here Nero is shown as a fairly idealized child. As you know later, he will hardly be ideal. And in fact, he was murdered by his soldiers because he became too corrupt and evil. And as if you were here for the earlier presentation, he never played the fiddle because the fiddle was not yet invented. Nobody's ever mentioned that before. But and again, these images were promulgated, and of course Nero wanted to promulgate himself as a charming child rather than as the brutal emperor he became. Now we get to a relief. This is in both high and low relief. The three soldiers in the front, as you can see, practically leap forth from the wall, and then there are three figures sort of more in the background in low relief. And this gives you the illusion of depth when you have something in front highly modeled and in the back slightly modeled. This, although is really a fabulous piece, beautifully done, they have been identified as high-ranking generals or soldiers by not only their very decorated clothing, their fabulous helmets with plumes, but also their shoes. Only higher-ranking people wore sandals like they did. And this is called the Praetorian relief, because it is thought that they were members of the Praetorian Guard, which would have been the high, like the guard of the emperor. And I told you the style before Augustus was super realistic, and it is called verism, V-E-R-I-S-M. It is the style of the late Republic, warts and all. Usually of older men. Why of older men? Because before Augustus it was thought the height was to be an old man because you were wise. All old men supposedly were wise. And so sometimes women, and you can see this is not necessarily a flattering portrait, were also shown in that style. So you need to know about Verism. It is believed that the style originated from funerary masks or funerary portraits that important families had of their members and that were paraded once or twice a year. And it was the means of venerating the ancestors. You had them in a special place. You may have not even taken them out every day, but they were highly realistic. And they were probably made originally from wax casts or as a death mask. Not necessarily, but often. So you need to know about Verism. And here we have a detail from the Arch of Titus. Very famous detail. The Arch of Titus celebrates Titus's victory over Judea. And of course he sacked the temple. And this is on the inside of the arch, I believe. And of course it shows the sacking of the temple in Jerusalem. And it is a procession. You recall the Trajan's column is next. Is also a procession. It goes all the way around the column. It's taller in the bottom, it gets smaller towards the top, and it commemorates Trajan's successful campaigns. There were several over the Dacians. And actually Trajan was reasonably modest because he gives a lot of credit to his troops, and he had no intention of doing that. He was actually buried in space, so it's also a mausoleum, but I don't think that's a question about that. And last, before you get to lunch, we have the bust of head of Constantine, which is 8 feet 6 inches tall, and was part of a seated statue, totally 30 feet tall. Seated either on a bench, a chair, or a throne, you can't tell. And here, the pupils of the eyes have been drilled, so it looks even more staring at you than the head of the woman that we started the sculpture show with. And even though it can recognize it as Constantine, I mean, the features are still fairly regular, and the hairstyle was typical of Constantine. The forms have been much simplified, much flattened. There's much less detail. Some historians consider that shows that Roman art has decreased in ability. That is stylistic, but it's a stylistic change. The here was not to do a realistic portrait of Constantine, but to do an image of power. When you saw this statue 30 foot high, you were going to be overawed by Constantine, even if it's not as beautiful as Augustus was. It does not show any failure in the part of Roman art. It just shows a different focus, as will then later become the focus in both in Byzantine art and in early medieval art. So, I hope this will help you. And I'm here in person to answer any questions that you may have. If not, you can all go to lunch. Yes.
Will there be any art from the catacombs?
No. Actually, no. From the catacombs. If there's art from the catacombs. No, I think most of the art is either floors. I don't know where they came from. Or wall paintings, which came usually from. Actually, not from public buildings as such.